Larry Magid, and this is Doing Tech Right, a podcast from ConnectSafely, where we and our guests speak about parenting, tech, and related topics, along with strategies and policies to make tech safer and more civil. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe and visit us at ConnectSafely.org. Hi there. I am so excited to talk about my friend and colleague, Shea Gardner. I'm going to let her give her own bio because when I hang out with her, we don't talk about each other's background. We just enjoy each other's company, especially as we work together with some of our partners. She's on a couple of boards with me, and I've always found her delightful. And in addition to being delightful, Shae is it policy director for LGBTQ Tech? Do I have that right?
Yeah, so I'm the director of policy and research for LGBT Tech. So I help sort of spearhead exactly what that sounds like. A lot of our sort of external messaging efforts, making sure that what we fight for as an organization is understood and respected by people who make the decisions that impact us most.
Talk to me a little bit about what LGBT Tech does and what your programs are and where you fit into all of that.
So let me start by saying that LGBTQ plus individuals have sort of a unique and distinct existence within the digital landscape, right? Our community increasingly relies on technology and on digital spaces to find community, to find resources, to find healthcare, to find employment, to find everything that is increasingly difficult for us to find in the real world. At the same time, members of the LGBTQ plus community suffer from worsened socioeconomic outcomes that make finding and maintaining that technology access harder than it is for other folks. So LGBT Tech we're a nonprofit. Our executive director lovingly refers to us as a think tank with a programmatic branch.
So as a piece of background, and you and I have talked about this, ConnectSafely, I think, wrote the very first LGBTQ guide to cyberbullying a number of years ago. They were actually written by Warren Blumenfeld, who was a childhood friend of mine and has become, over the past several decades, a leader in LGBTQ rights. And in it, we documented how gay people, lesbians, trans people had more of a risk of cyberbullying and harassment and other negative outcomes than the straight community. That was written several years ago. And I'm curious whether things have gotten, I won't even say any better, any different, any better, any worse, how things have changed. And what is the current state, of the risk factor that any queer person online might be experiencing?
Yeah, it is. That is an incredibly interesting question. What I will say, firstly, is that I think it's important to acknowledge that all of that sort of hate and harassment and cyberbullying that LGBTQ plus people are facing in digital spaces, that's not existing in a vacuum, right? That is very real world hate and harassment and bigotry that's being replicated, and in the worst cases, being made worse in digital spaces. So it is something that's really remarkable to me. We do an annual poll of LGBTQ plus individuals in the United States on their digital experiences. And something we've found year over year is that LGBTQ plus folks are saying that hate and harassment are very bad in online spaces. Mm-hmm. At the same time, they are also saying they still feel safer in those spaces than they do in physical offline ones. So it is very telling to me that I think while we're watching online, we're watching folks try to navigate a worsening political environment and a more questionable amount of safety for themselves. It is, I think, across the board, we're seeing the same things online that we are in the real world, which is for our community, things are getting worse. They're getting tougher.
Yeah. I sense that from my friends, especially my trans friends. I have a good friend who's a very prominent journalist and happens to be trans woman. And she has indicated some very strong concerns about what's going on. And ConnectSafely is a non-political, bipartisan, nonpartisan, whatever you want to call it, organization. We don't get involved in political dialogue specifically, but there is a climate today that comes from the very top of our society, and I think it's having an impact. I mean, I sense that for my friends who feel very much afraid, where I don't think that fear was quite as intense, 2 years ago or so.
None of this is happening in a vacuum, right? technological access, digital experiences, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. And none of the legislation that impacts those spaces happens in a vacuum either. So it is, LGBT Tech is a 501c3, but
Agreed.
we do a lot of education around federal and state level legislation that may impact the community. And when looking at a lot of these bills that are out today, especially around youth safety, it is remarkable to me how many of them may be so well intentioned, but because they are not happening in a vacuum, some of the provisions and issues within them actually do make them very dangerous.
It brings up an issue I've struggled with for a long time. So, as you know, there is a movement pressure to do a lot of things that would restrict youth access to social media, for example.
Hmm.
Australia, they've banned it for youth under 16. And I don't think we're going to have a ban in this country, but I do think it's very likely that parental controls are going to be mandated. And I think that works for a lot of families. I think there's a lot of families for whom the kids might even welcome some parental help in managing their social media. But there are other kids, other young people in our society for whom parental controls could actually stifle their ability to gather information that could enhance their health, enhance their safety, enhance their mental health. And I'm
Hmm.
thinking specifically, not exclusively, but
Hmm.
I'm thinking specifically about the LGBTQ community, as well as religious minorities, or for that matter, even young people whose political views may differ from those of their parents. And I worry both from a First Amendment standpoint of just anybody's rights to express themselves and to learn from media that they're exposed to, but also to gather, to assemble, to interact with people who can help them. And I'm just curious your take on that.
I think you hit the nail on the head with it, right? The vast majority of LGBTQ plus youth do not feel that they are in affirming homes. Where are they going to go to try to find that out, right? It's going to be digital spaces, online spaces. It's going to be platforms and services that they go online to try to either figure out who they are, to find other people like them, and to figure out if what they're feeling that they may be is okay, right? No one knows it's okay to be something until you see someone being okay being that thing. And that is really the power of technological access right now. And that is so important to protect when we have these conversations about stifling youth access to this. I do want to be clear, right? This is not me saying that parents don't have a role in this conversation at all. Yeah. Two things can be true at once, right? On one hand, we can look at young people and say, you don't know everything about the world and you do need to be protected from some things in it. And on the other hand, we can also say, okay, maybe that protection doesn't need to reach the point of censorship and stifling. And, historically, whether tech or not, I don't think that's ever worked when you looked at teenagers.
Didn't work even when I was a kid. That was a long time before the internet. And I referenced earlier, it's not just the LGBTQ community that's affected. It's sort of like when I think about how the disabilities community lobbied successfully, at least in many communities, to have ramps on sidewalks. Well,
Yeah,
as
the
somebody
digital
who rides
curb
a
cut
bicycle,
effect.
yeah, as somebody who rides a bicycle and now as a grandfather and pushing a stroller,
Yeah,
I benefit from those curbs, ramps, even though I'm not disabled. And so
yeah.
I think that there are other members of a society, other young people who could be stifled from experiencing things that I mentioned. It could be religious, it could be political, it could be a lot of things. And again, I agree with you. I'm not suggesting that parents shouldn't have a role in supervising their children's lives. But the question is, how can we do that in a way that doesn't either stifle or, in extreme cases, even endanger young people?
Right. And I think that's going to look a little different for everyone. And I think it's worth noting that right now, if we are putting our trust in the federal government to handle this well, I don't think any of us are going to get very far, right? So while I don't think it's no silver bullet solution to lean into this idea of education and digital literacy and making sure that folks have the best understanding possible of the platforms they're on and the tools that are available to them, I do think that is one of the best things we can do ourselves in the meantime, while, ivory towers do what they do.
What kind of, you mentioned you do policy work. What does that entail? And how do you, I know as a 501c3, you have to be nonpartisan. How do you sort of navigate that?
Yeah, I am sure I am not the first person anyone will have heard say this, but if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That's
Hmm.
a really good way of kind of approaching the policy work that we do, right? I see members of the LGBTQ plus community and our content and our users' needs as almost a little bit of a canary in the coal mine. If technology is being created in a way that can account for the LGBTQ plus community, especially when we have not necessarily been included or recorded very well over time, if you're creating something that can account for us and serve us as a community, you're probably creating something that also benefits other communities. You were
Hmm.
just referencing the digital curb cut effect, right? If you're creating a technology that harms members of the LGBTQ plus community or technology policy that harms us, chances are it's going to harm many other groups of people as well, including all of those that we intersect with as a community. So it's a very long-winded way, I think, to say that we try to fight to make sure that LGBTQ plus people are included in the conversation about how these things need to change and where they need to go, because we recognize if we're not fighting for that at the outset, we're feeling it at the end result.
So I know you're on the policy side, but I also know that you fully can easily answer my question. Let's just talk about strategies, survival strategies, I think is a fair word, for LGBTQ community who are online, who want to use services
Yeah.
like TikTok or Instagram or Snapchat or Discord or whatever is out there that they're using. I may be missing some. How they can use them in a way that's productively and safe, or for that matter, develop the resilience to survive even when it may not be as safe as we all wish it would be.
I will give one specific example because I don't want this to sound like I'm just throwing out these really broad policy strategy ideas, right? On many of these social media platforms, you can go into your privacy settings and you can include keywords that you want blocked in your comments or keywords that you do not want showing up in your searches. And this is something that I think everyone should know about. I think it's incredibly handy. But when you're thinking about members of our community, that allows individuals to go in if they're trans and write a dead name into there. That allows me to go in and to write, maybe some of the slurs or negative things that have been said to me as a lesbian. I can include those as keywords if I think that a moderation system wouldn't necessarily pick up on the nuance.
Mhm.
There are these sorts of tools available on each platform that I want folks to become aware of so they understand how best to protect themselves.
Yeah.
It is something as a community we've always been very good at protecting ourselves. I don't think in this political environment that's unfortunately changing right now. And I know that's just one small example. What I will say is LGBT Tech is actually working on a resource right now. I didn't even tell you about this before the podcast. It's just perfect. LGBT Tech is working on a resource to actually combine those sorts of hate, harassment, and content moderation tools on each social media platform and publish them into one online resource for folks. So at the very least, you can know what tools are available to you, and then you can decide to use them or
Oh,
not.
that's great. We're going to want to amplify that when that becomes available.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about your 2026 agenda.
Ooh.
What what do you have in mind for this year? And I want to include AI. I was going to ask you separately about AI,
Yeah.
but boy, as every day goes by, AI becomes further and further at the top of everyone's agenda, including Connect Safely's, and
Yeah.
where all this fits in.
LGBT Tech recently put out our annual report, which is called Beyond Binary, LGBTQ plus rights in the digital landscape. We put it out in January every year, and it does help serve as kind of that high level overview of our policy areas, or at least our best guess of where we're going to be, right? Everything moves very rapidly, at least in technology.
Mhm.
So, what I can say for now is there are really four areas that I am watching very, very closely. The first is and these are outlined actually in this order in the report, which is why I'm able to rattle them off, hopefully pretty succinctly. But the first is access, right? There, with the Trump administration coming back into office and upending existing infrastructure and funding programs that were created by the previous administration around broadband access, there's a lot of uncertainty around affordability programs for folks. That's not going away, right?
Mhm.
Especially not in this economy, not in this moment. So we are very closely watching how members of our community are not able to access things like devices and connectivity, which is the baseline for everything else that we've talked about today. The important, what happens once they're online. I would say the second area is the platform landscape, right? We are watching what's happening with these social media platforms on in two lenses. The first being legislatively, the decisions being made that impact them. And the second is on the industry level. What are the choices they are making in this moment that inevitably are going to impact the users and the content that are hosted on them? So that is what we talked about before about, youth on these platforms is obviously going to be a big one. But even something as nondescript as gaming platforms, right? That has become more of a conversation, and we're really watching something like ephemeral messaging, which is messaging features that disappear after an amount of time. That's on the chopping block.
Mhm.
Section 230 is a huge one. That's a very important law that allows folks to kind of maintain free speech on the internet. That's on the chopping block. So there's a lot happening in that space. The third is the privacy landscape. In the United States, we still do not have a federal privacy framework protecting everybody. So we are continuing to push for that. We are continuing to fight back against things like the data broker industry who take all of our data and sell it willy-nilly. And we are trying to make sure that the conversation about needing to protect young people does not exclude the fact that none of us have protections right now. We are really on an island when you look at international policy in this, in that none of us are protected, none of our privacy is. We have to make steps on that. And then finally, it's the AI landscape, right?
Yeah.
Which is, everything you imagine it is, and then some better and then some worse. So uh, I am really in 2026 trying to approach AI as sort of a life cycle of a system, looking at it from development through deployment and trying to understand what decisions are being made at every point in those processes that are going to impact marginalized people.
Yeah, I'm curious about how AI impacts the LGBTQ community differently than it might impact the straight community.
Yeah, there is I mentioned I'm looking at it as a life cycle. So when you look at that life cycle of an AI system, let's start with the let's start with the development part of that process. Are you training and building AI systems that can account for LGBTQ plus individuals?
Mhm.
And there are some very easy metrics to track that, right? For example, are you teaching AI systems that an individual's qualities are something that will stay stagnant their entire life or something that can change over time? Because we know
Mhm.
that sexuality and gender identity often shifts for people throughout their lives. But
Mhm.
if a system cannot recognize that, it may exclude that individual as an anomaly. So it is something as very simple as making sure you are training with inclusivity in mind. That then goes all the way down to the deployment side of things. You want to look at areas like employment or healthcare, which we know have already been areas where LGBTQ plus individuals have disparate outcomes based on nothing but their sexual orientation or their gender identity. If you are using an AI system to pursue employment or healthcare, how are you doing that in a way that does not negatively account for sexual orientation or gender identity? And if you did not train for it at the beginning, it's going to be very difficult at that point. And then what I will say finally is sort of that consumer access point, right? Which this goes more to things like AI chatbots in particular, which is how is AI, how are these language models, these synthetic companions, how are they interacting with individuals? Are they doing it in a way that is inclusive and supportive? Are they doing it in a way that does not take them away from potential real world help? This is an incredibly gray area. I know you're about to ask me about more of it.
I am. I'm particularly interested in the chatbot and the romantic
Yep.
conversations. It's been very interesting. Our partners, full disclosure, are all of the major AI companies. We work with OpenAI, we work with Meta, we work
Mhm.
with Google, and we work with Character AI. And Character AI in particular had a
Mm.
tragedy, a suicide, and decided to ban minors, or at least I don't know. Yeah, I think all minors from using their service because they felt that they couldn't control it. That it wasn't more than just an algorithm. They couldn't keep the model, they couldn't control the model from doing harm. OpenAI has had also a tragedy, and there is a general belief, and I am one of the people who have said this, that it is problematic for young people to be engaged in romantic conversation
Mm.
with AI chatbots. And there was a whole controversy around Meta,
Yeah.
allegedly, and I don't know this to be the case, but allegedly Zuckerberg was advised not to allow the models to engage in romantic conversation with young people, and allegedly he overruled that, whatever. But then I'm questioning, well, I actually feel that way, that it's inappropriate to allow young people to engage in romantic conversations. But I remember having conversations with some LGBTQ leaders many, many years ago around a very different subject, around the Communications Decency Act that was overturned by the Supreme Court. And he made the argument that some of the things that we consider inappropriate for minors are actually lifelines for some communities, the disabled community and other communities. And it's like, I'm wondering whether I want to re-examine my own beliefs. Is there a case that could be made where certain marginalized youth should be allowed to have a romantic conversation with a chatbot?
The romantic conversation, I think, is probably, and I'm not saying this necessarily as a compliment, but probably the most interesting, right? And I say that to mean it is maybe the most difficult to figure out where that line is being drawn.
Exactly.
I think there is taking it slightly from romance to sort of the larger conversation around emotional connection that's being formed, these really strong parasocial relationships that are being formed with chatbots and synthetic companions right now. I think I always try to encourage people in this conversation, first and foremost, to recognize that is likely not that individual's first option, right? It is not it may well be their only. And figuring out that nuance around it is very important to then the conversation which follows, which is like, okay, well, that is still an algorithm, that is still a technology, that is still not a person. And whoever's on the receiving end needs to be aware of that and needs to be able to make appropriate decisions for themselves and in having those conversations. This is something I've mentioned to you in the past, right? As I was 15 years old the first time I went online, I Googled, is it okay to be gay? I didn't feel like I found a great answer. So I went on one of those social media forum platforms, I won't name which, but I posted it anonymously on there. I said, is it okay to be gay? And I just didn't know. I just didn't know how the people around me were going to react, how my family was going to react. And I was in desperate need of someone to just tell me yes. And that is what social media did end up providing me at that point in my life. If I were 15 now, I think I probably would go to a chatbot. It probably would be a chatbot that I would type that exact question into and press enter. And whatever response it gets back is not something you can take back. That is, not an individual looking for a nuanced take on the different societal approaches to being queer or gay or trans. That is a young person who is just in need of a yes. And
by the way, you'll be pleased to know that as you were talking, I typed that very query into ChatGPT. Yes, It is completely okay to be gay. Being gay is a normal part of human diversity. And it goes on and on and on. So
yes. Yep. It is
in case you were still wondering, Shae, you have it officially from ChatGPT. It's okay.
It is, Some folks got me questioning these days.
No, but I mean, I could easily see a young person asking that very question. And fortunately, at least as ChatGPT answered me at this very moment, because as you know, these things can readjust themselves on the fly. Fortunately, it gave me an answer which would be reassuring.
Yes, which would be reassuring, I think. It's speaking back to 15-year-old me, I think that would be a reassuring answer. It also, it does, I think it speaks to the larger issue around therapy and therapeutic uses for things like chatbot. It is no secret in this country that we do have mental health crises in young people and adults alike. It is also no secret that healthcare is very hard to attain and that therapy is not as accessible as it needs to be. So we found ourselves in a really unfortunate, but probably pretty predictable circumstance, right? Where we are saying, okay, if this is someone's only lifeline, I don't want to take it away, but this probably shouldn't be the lifeline. So what do we do?
I mean, the question that I struggle with is, where is it written that a machine is incapable of providing a reasonable amount of psychological counseling and feedback? Now, I mean, I understand the concerns and I share them.
Mm-hmm.
I am worried about it. I do worry about people getting the wrong information, although there have been plenty of cases when human therapists have given bad information as well. In fact, I could even see situations in your community where that could very well be the case. If you live in a community, if you live in a geographic community where you don't have access to a thoughtful, caring, tolerant therapist, maybe AI is the only choice you have if you're looking for
Right.
some kind of counseling.
When it comes to medical and therapeutic advice, there is a level here of folks looking at doctors and looking at therapists and saying, okay, you have gone through this amount of education and this amount of training and this amount of experience and this amount of real life experience, that makes me feel like I can trust you with this. Or if you are a parent, makes me feel like I can trust my child with you to sort of help them through this thing that they are navigating. And I've seen some really interesting legislative efforts around requiring AI chatbots to announce in conversations, to essentially disclose that they are
Yeah,
not medical experts, that they
yeah.
are not therapeutic experts. And I do think
That
something
they are
as
not human
simple.
beings.
Yes, that they are not human beings. That was going to be the next point I bring up,
Yeah,
right? Some level of disclosure, some level of reminder to the individual they're speaking to that, hey, I'm sure the message wouldn't read exactly this way, right? But it's something along the lines of, hey, I've been trained to talk to you like a person, but I'm not. Like, I'm not a
right.
human being. Here is my best answer based on what I can pull from the information I have available to me. But if you have access, you should probably talk to someone in the real world. But at the end of the day, I don't think the answer is letting a chatbot claim and act completely as a therapist. I also don't think the answer is as black and white as banning any
Banning its
sort
use.
of
But
emotional use at all.
well, Shae, we're out of time. And one of the things
Yeah.
that I love about this conversation is that it kind of proves the point I made at the very beginning that the mission you're on has a lot to do with a particular community, but a
Hmm.
lot to do with the human beings as a whole. And even as we got into our conversation around AI, we got completely off the topic of LGBTQ issues. And I think that's okay because we're talking about people, and people come in all shapes and sizes and genders and
Hmm.
orientations and you name it.
Yeah.
We are a very diverse species, and but we have a lot in common.
Yeah, it is. Nothing makes me happier than when something I am fighting for or talking about in reference to the LGBTQ plus community is applicable to people outside of that, right? I obviously do not think you have to be part of a community to care about it.
Yeah,
No community has had things improve for them until other people outside of it cared enough to help. That's a
I absolutely
huge
agree.
part
And
of the fight. Yeah. But at the same time, there is something to be said about improving needs for a community does it spills outwards, right? It is the most beautiful butterfly effect is when something you do to help someone who is not you spreads outwards.
Shae, it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
I know. I fear we could just keep going, and it's a always in all of you and the work you do. Continue to love working next to you in sort of this good fight. But appreciate you
Agreed.
tremendously.
And thank you so much. Appreciate it. Take care.
Bye.
Doing Tech Right is produced by Christopher Lee. Maureen Cochan is executive producer. Theme music by Will Magid. I'm Larry Magid.